In his book, Interventions, author Noam Chomsky discusses U.S. foreign policy and other topics. This event, hosted by Backpages Books in Waltham, Massachusetts, is a little over an hour.
So where so much of then, it seems like the world leadership, I think most recently, of course, you hear about Benazir Bhutto having been educated in this area and at Harvard, and so many of the world leaders seem to come here to be educated, for better or for worse. You know,
remember how recent that is.
Definitely.
I mean, look, up until the Second World War, the United States was kind of a cultural backwater.
Sure.
If you wanted to study philosophy or physics, you'd go to England or Germany. You want to be a writer, you'd go to Paris. You know, the United States at that time, in its relation to the rest of the world, was kind of like, I don't want to insult anybody, but maybe central Indiana to Boston today. You know,
yeah.
It's a place you tried to get out of if you wanted to be a creative writer or thinker or something. That changed during the Second World War.
Sure.
And it, you know, in fact, the whole relationship between the United States and the world changed. And part of it was much of the rest of the industrial world was seriously harmed or destroyed, and the United States gained enormously during the war. In fact, it already was by far the richest country in the world, but industrial production more than tripled during the Second World War, and it just ended up, the United States ended up having half the wealth of the world.
Yeah.
There's never been anything like that in history, and it affected the mentality, the institutions, and so on, and there's this radical shift. So what we see today is not the traditional United States.
Certainly, certainly. Now, are there any commonalities in these people who come out of this sort of modern education system who are becoming world leaders around? Do there seem to be sort of a similar foundational approach? Are they taking anything out of this American system or this American ideal?
Well, if that is true, it does not reflect very well on the educational system here. Take a look at the world and you say,
sure.
Is this what we want to train people to create?
Sure, sure.
I suppose it's true.
I guess it ties into a question I've been thinking about, is sort of obsessively rereading a poem called The Hollow Men by T.S. Eliot, and it begins this: we are the hollow men, we are the straw men, but it ends with the lullaby, sort of this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang but with a whimper. And it strikes me that you know, I look to education very often as a root of how people comport themselves, even in the political sphere, where maybe we perhaps shouldn't be expecting that to be a relevant sort of part of your resume, but that it seems to me that for all of the bombastic things that are happening around the world, it seems to be occurring here almost as a whimper. As a whimper. And as the end of this poem, that it seems to be incredibly muted here.
In Boston?
In Boston and in America in general. And while there are definitely large movements, you know, there's a level of obfuscation that seems to be preventing that from being a general sentiment that you feel day to day, walking around. And I wonder are there other places like this in the world where people feel muted? Do they feel almost as though things are, for how large the scale they are in what's happening, that it oddly has this sort of played down sense to your maybe your sensibility of what you can do about it, but maybe your sensibility of even how to grasp the concept of what's happening in the first place?
I guess I just don't see it that way, really. In fact, it seems to me more exciting now than it was 30 years ago, and much more than it was 50 years ago.
In what ways? Because I guess...
Well, let's just take this room.
Absolutely.
Okay. When I started giving talks on general topics, it was originally the Vietnam War, back in the early 60s. A talk would be in somebody's living room with two neighbors, or in a church with 4 people, the minister, the organizer, somebody who wanted to kill me, and a drunk who walked in off the streets. You know? And that was the level of concern for the outside world. In fact, horrible things were going on all over the world. The United States was involved in them, and nobody cared. For example, I don't want to take a poll, but Try it with your friends. I mean, very few people even know when the United States attacked South Vietnam. I mean, that was one of the major events of the, modern history. Ask people, when did the United States attack South Vietnam? I mean, we did have a client state there, which killed about maybe 60, 70,000 people during the 50s. But when did the invasion take place? Well, it turns out it was 1962. Nobody cared. I mean, it wasn't a secret. You could read in the back pages of the New York Times that John F. Kennedy had sent the U.S. Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam under South Vietnamese markings, planes with South Vietnamese markings, so they wouldn't know that that huge jet there is the U.S. Air Force. It's when they started the programs of chemical warfare to destroy crops and ground cover. They started rounding people up and driving them into what were amounted to concentration camps, ultimately millions of people into strategic hamlets and urban slums, authorized napalm, really big attack. Nobody even cared. I mean, a couple of years, it was years before things really became vitalized. And the 60s just changed the place enormously. So, for example, a meeting like this would have been inconceivable. In fact, as late as the late 60s, the politically active groups, like say SDS, you could barely mention a word like capitalism. People would shrink and, oh, God, that's really a frightening concept to talk about that. I mean, things we just take for granted now were considered outlandish then, and in many areas. In fact, it's striking to compare the beginning of the Vietnam War with the beginning of the Iraq War. In the case of the Iraq War, there were huge protests before the war started. In the case of Vietnam, you didn't get protests of that scale until South Vietnam had been essentially destroyed, and much of the rest of the region as well.
I think there is a remaking that goes on, though, so that the sense of people who weren't alive or aware during that period is often that, yeah, the 60s are this decade. They start in 1960, they end in 1969.
See, but they didn't end. That's the strike. It's picked up since then.
Absolutely.
I mean, the major popular movements that have had a real effect on the society are from a later period. Take, say, the women's movement, which just changed the society enormously. I mean, take, say, MIT again, since I want to talk about Boston. If you walk down the halls of MIT when I got there, in 1955, you'd see white, well-dressed, deferential males. Okay? Take a walk down the halls now, well, you know what you're going to see. It's about half women, a third minorities, casual dress, informal relations. It's just a political activism was unheard of at the time, and it's just changed tremendously. And that's changed all over the country. But the women's movement is primarily a product of the 60s. I mean, the germs were in the 70s. The germs were there in the 60s, but barely, And then it picked up and changed things enormously. Or take, say, the environmental movement. I mean, speaking of the end of the earth, that's going to be important. There was almost nothing in the 60s. It began to develop in the 70s. The solidarity movement, Central American solidarity movements now worldwide, that's the 80s. And that's something new in Western history. I mean, no one, say in France, ever thought of going to live in an Algerian or a Vietnamese village in order to help the people who were under attack from French violence. Nobody thought of going to live in a Vietnamese village. But in the 1980s, thousands of people did it. And now it's all over the world.
I guess it begs almost a simple definition question that is, sort of what is contemporary liberalism, with my sense that you say platforms, there are not necessarily the same kinds of platforms and movements, especially where you can say, I am liberal and I am a communist, I am liberal and I am a socialist, or I'm an anarchist. They're not, you don't hear that as often in these discussions now. There seems to be different kind of solidarity and a different kind of definition of liberalism. And I wonder what you see that as being now.
I mean, one reason is the words have simply lost meaning. So what does it mean to be a liberal or a communist or anything else? I mean, the point that Orwell made, I mean, one way of trying to undermine independent thought and creative approaches to the world is to simply destroy the way of talking about things. So the words literally almost have no meaning. In fact, by now, just about every word that's used in political discourse has at least two meanings, a literal meaning and its opposite. And it's the opposite that's normally used. So take a contemporary debate that's going on right now. You see headlines in newspapers about a report on foreign fighters in Iraq. Condoleezza Rice announces that that there's an asked a question about how can we settle the problem in Iraq. So it's quite easy. Just keep the foreign fighters out, keep the foreign weapons out, and it'll all be settled. And nobody bats an eyelash. Are there 150,000 U.S. troops there? I mean, are they bringing in weapons? They're not foreign, because anything we do is not foreign. If we invaded Canada, they would be enemy combatants, and we would be there by right. So the concepts like aggression, invasion, terror, anything you mentioned doesn't exist. I mean, take democracy. George Bush was in Egypt yesterday, praising President Mubarak. I mean, Egyptians are writhing at the same time he's giving talks about how we have to promote democracy and so on. I mean, they just come from Saudi Arabia, the most extreme, one of the most extreme fundamentalist tyrannies in the world. See a picture of him with King Abdullah watching a horse show and so on and so forth. I mean, what are we to make of all of this? The terms for discussing things have been almost evacuated of content. That's why you don't hear these words. But on the other hand, people's instincts and commitments and engagements, I think, are significantly improved over the 60s. I mean, take your own field, okay, which you were telling me about.
Yeah, studied
American archaeology.
Sure.
You go back to the 1960s, the general assumption, even in the academic world, was that there was nobody living in this hemisphere, just a couple of savages wandering around. The idea that what has been discovered about the pre-contact history is just, it's kind of mind-boggling if you go back and look at what was even in the scholarly literature at the time, let alone in people's ordinary mentality. I mean, like when I was growing up as a kid, I considered myself pretty leftist, but we'd play cowboys and Indians where we were the cowboys, killing the Indians. If maybe it still happens somewhere, but wouldn't be my children. They wouldn't have done that. These are just changes that took place in our consciousness, our conception of what the past was, what we've done, who we are, how we relate to one another. It's just changed enormously. A lot of sparks were lit in the 60s, but much of it took off later. For example, the beginnings of the rediscovery, actually, of the what happened, the original sin of this country, what happened to the native population, that really just began in the 70s.
Yeah.
From outside the academic world, incidentally. People like Francis Jennings and others.
Where these words have lost so much, if not all, of their meaning, and you look at the sort of, there's a rhetorical sort of tactic of this government in particular, which is sort of the broad blitz of you send out, the top 10 people you have, and you reiterate the lie on 10 news programs at once in the same sort of quasi-double-speak sort of way so that it becomes a truth. I wonder, is that, if you look at the rhetoric being used by other world leaders or around the world, whether it's Vladimir Putin or whether it's Sarkozy or whether it's Hugo Chavez, are there drastically different tactics of the same sort of approach being used right now, or are they Are they sort of all following this model of just sort of blitzing the same idea over and over until people don't particularly listen, I think?
Well, it's a mistake to expect anything from leaders other than attempts to expand their power and control and domination. They differ, you know. But as soon as you mention the word leader, you should shudder and look somewhere else. In a free society, you might have representatives, but you wouldn't have leaders.
Yeah.
So let's imagine that this was a really functioning, we're in the primary season. What would a democratic primary be? Say, take New Hampshire. It wouldn't be a candidate comes into a town and says, tells you lies about themselves. What would happen is the people in the town would get together and say, look, work out the kinds of programs they want the next president to follow. And then if somebody wants to come in to be elected, they'd say, okay, you can come, here's what we want you to do. If you're willing to do that, maybe we'll vote for you. If you're not, we're not willing to vote for you. But you don't have, and then there should be mechanisms to ensure that they do it, or else you throw them out. But the way we do it is quite different. The leaders come, they tell you what, they present themselves, usually falsely, and you're then to decide, well, do I want him or do I want him? But that's completely backwards from what a functioning democratic society would be. So when you talk about leaders, you have to shiver. On the other hand, there are differences. So take, say, Chavez, who you mentioned. On December, I don't know how many people know this, but on December 31st, at the end of last year, Chavez announced an amnesty for participants in the military coup in 2002, April 2002, not for all of them, for many of them. This is a military coup backed by the United States, probably with participation, U.S. participation, certainly support, which overthrew the government, kidnapped the president, disbanded Parliament and the Supreme Court, every other democratic institution, applauded in the United States, denounced in Latin America almost entirely. It was overturned a couple of days later. But suppose it had happened here. Suppose there was a military coup here, which overthrew the government, you know, kidnapped George Bush, disbanded Congress, and then there was a popular uprising and it overturned the coup. I mean, would they be amnestied, the people who took part in it? I mean, they get the death sentence. You know, there wouldn't be any question of amnesty. Well, I don't know if it was out of embarrassment or lack of interest, but actually I had a friend do a database search on coverage of the amnesty. A couple of lines, scattered lines here and there. You know. I'm sure you know that Chavez is like a demon in the Western press, and one of his worst crimes, which just elicited a torrent of abuse, was canceling the license of a television station, RCTV. Actually didn't close the station, contrary to what was said. He canceled their license to take up a large part of the publicly owned frequencies. They could still go on cable. That was considered utterly horrendous, and the press denounced them, saying this kind of thing could never happen here, which is perfectly true. It couldn't happen here, but very few pointed out the reason. The station, you have to think of an analogy. Let's go back to the imagined military coup in the United States, the way I described. Suppose that CBS helped instigate the coup, supported it openly. As the popular uprising took place that overthrew the coup leaders, CBS started playing comedies and anything so that people wouldn't know what's going on in the streets. What would happen to CBS afterwards, to their managers and owners? Would they be allowed to keep broadcasting for 5 years and then have their license for public broadcasting removed? They'd be immediately sent to jail, probably get the death sentence. So it's true, it wouldn't happen here, but not for exactly the reasons that were mentioned. Well, we can go on and on like this. We simply, let me take one last example to illustrate just our, the difficulty of applying to ourselves the standards we do to others. Take 9/11. Terrible atrocity, a huge outpouring of sympathy and support all over the world, including, incidentally, from the jihadi movements. They later turned because of our reaction to it, but at the beginning they were highly condemned it very strongly. And it was a terrible atrocity, undoubtedly. But it could have been worse. So let's imagine how it could have been worse, for example. Suppose that on September 11th, Al-Qaeda had bombed the White House, killed the president, instituted a murderous, brutal regime which killed maybe 50 to 100,000 people and tortured about 700,000, set up a major international terror center in Washington, which was overthrowing governments all over the world, installing brutal, vicious neo-Nazi dictatorships, assassinating people. Suppose he called in a bunch of economists, let's call them the Kandahar boys, to run the American economy, who within a couple of years had driven the economy into one of the worst collapses of its history. Suppose that this had happened. Well, that would have been worse than 9/11, right? What did happen? And it happened on 9/11. It happened on September 11th, 1973 in Chile. The only thing I've changed is per capita equivalence, which is the right way to look at it. Well, did that change the world? Yeah, it did, but not from our point of view. In fact, who even knows about it?
Well, because, and because, just in terms of your comment of the report.
And incidentally, just to finish, we were responsible for that one.
Definitely, but because, as you said with the amnesty on December 31st, which received no coverage, you look at Chile during that period and you look at the New York Times, majority of the articles are being filed from Argentina. They're not even being filed from Chile. So where is that, the magnitude of the event was immediately, I think, muted by the fact that nobody who was reporting for the American media was even there.
That's not the case. All the wire services covered it, which means that every editorial office knew it. I mean, every editorial office picks up Reuters and AP and AFP and so on. So yeah, every desk at every editorial office knew about it. They decided not to print it. The main reason is it just doesn't fit the image that's supposed to be presented. Actually, sure. I was even involved in that inadvertently. When Chavez was at the UN a couple of years ago, he gave a talk, gave a press conference, in which he allegedly said that he was very sorry that he hadn't been able to meet me before I died. And that was big stories all over the country. I was actually interviewed by the New York Times. They thought it was very funny. What did I have to say about it, and so on. So that was a big issue, because then you could show what a crazy idiot he is. Only one problem. That's not what he said. What he said is that, and it was very explicit, unambiguous, he said he was sorry that he hadn't been able to meet John Kenneth Galbraith before he died. Well, evidently the editorial offices decided that it wouldn't do to present the image of Chavez as somebody who admires a liberal icon. So they changed it. It was pointed out right away. A FAIR media monitoring organization, a very good one, immediately looked at the transcript and wrote the New York Times and others saying it's not what it was. And the New York Times did issue a correction. 17 days later, the bottom of whatever page of advertisements you have, it was a correction. All right, you can imagine that the American press didn't understand the Spanish. It's hard to imagine how John Kenneth Galbraith and Noam Chomsky would be confused, but let's imagine it. Did Le Monde not understand the Spanish? Did El Mercurio in Chile not understand the Spanish? No, this is just a way of demonizing a figure who the state orders you must demonize.
I think it...
This is independent of whether you like him or not. No, yeah. It's totally independent.
I think it strikes me more often that, while this was sort of an extraordinary, moment of just, baffling sort of rewriting that they did, that often it seems like the articles that you find and the reportage that you see is just diversion oriented. So that I remember reading an article about the coup in Chile, where it was a front-page New York Times article from just after September 11th, 1973, where the entire article was about bank runs in Argentina.
Yeah, that's right.
And nothing about Chile. There was no sense even that who was Pinochet, what was going on, what was at that point the junta that was in control.
And bear in mind, it's a much worse atrocity than our 9/11, what's often called in South America the second 9/11, for good reasons. Actually, just a personal incident. I had a teenage son who, my wife and I decided to take Lexington, where we lived, the Lexington movie theater was playing Missing, you know, the film about the. So we took our son, figured he'd learn something about it. He thought it was kind of an interesting adventure story. But as we were walking out of the theater, I was listening to people talking about it. I don't think much of the audience knew that it was about Chile. I mean, they knew that the American government had done some bad thing. They hadn't rescued this nice American guy. But that's about the level of it. And it's true that the film didn't spell out in detail, this is Chile, 1973, the United States helped instigate a coup which had all these horrible effects, but you know, it takes a remarkable degree of insularity not to know enough about the world to appreciate what this is. I should say that the second 9/11, ours, one of its consequences was to introduce many cracks in that insularity. It opened a lot of people's minds. You could see that in all sorts of ways. I mean, I could see it just personally, like the number of invitations from around the country to give talks just escalated radically. The audiences are much bigger, much more engaged. Small bookstores, like little left bookstores, which were barely struggling along, had to suddenly reprint books from the 1980s and 70s that had never sold because people were interested. I mean, a lot of people, one of the consequences of it was to shatter some of the kind of internal focus of a highly insular society and make people feel, look, we got to learn something about the world.
So do you think that even though perhaps these sort of platforms or identifiable movements attached to an issue may have sort of dropped off in certain ways in the old sort of polemical identification way, that now perhaps it is the seeking of information that drives this more than anything? Because I think it is abundantly clear to people that it's, you can't just turn on the CBS evening news. This clip emerged last week of Katie Couric, clips between her segments from New Hampshire where she, it's clear that she sort of has no sense whatsoever of what even she's reporting on, so that people, perhaps it is the seeking in and of itself that might be engendering the larger sort of active sense that people have.
Well, it's hard to generalize about a diverse and complex society like this one, but there are tendencies that you can identify, and one tendency is to a certain level of skepticism, a certain level of interest and independent inquiry, trying to find out what happened. I mean, it can lead in crazy directions too. It can lead to wild conspiracy theories and so on and so forth. The internet kind of tends to engender that kind of phenomenon, but it's also just a much healthier concern with things that are happening in the world.
Well, and
the
internet also brings in, I think, a tremendous amount you can't find anywhere else. It does. And perhaps that may be what makes it better, is this sense that you have to be more discerning with what you're reading, but you're prepared to be discerning, which was not the case perhaps with the older media up on that cusp of when the internet was, I think, sort of really rising. That a lot of folks, I think, weren't as able to be as rapidly critical of.
No, because you got one picture, the morning newspaper, the local television station.
Yeah.
And now, if you want, at least, you can get quite a wide variety of information. For example, the things I just mentioned, you can find out about. It takes, as you say, discernment. First of all, commitment, and then discernment. Not much different from the sciences in that respect. You can't just take a look at all the data that exists and come up with a theory. You have to know what makes sense to look at, what doesn't make sense. You have to have a sort of framework of interpretation. I mean, the best scientist is not the one who can list all the papers that have been written on the topic that he's working on. It's the one who knows what to look at. Actually, I had a friend at MIT who was a Nobel Prize laureate in biology once described to me how he taught his classes. He said he goes in and gives a lecture about the way he thinks these things ought to be, just in principle. And then the task of the students is to check the literature and find out if he's right. And that's kind of the way you have to look at the world, too. There's just, you can get overwhelmed with meaningless data. You have to pick out what matters, which does take discernment and training and so on. If we had the kind of educational systems that you and I, the rest of us, would like to have, that's what children would be trained to do, would be encouraged to do, figure out how to do it. It's very different than No Child Left Behind, where you're trained to pass a test.
Certainly. I've gotten selfish here. I don't know if anybody has a question on this sort of topic at all. Yes, you.
Yes, as a child of the period of the 1930s and 40s, period of the war and the Holocaust and so on, I grew up thinking, as I got older, that the world is never going to be like this again. I have quite an optimistic view of how things have changed. But as time goes on, as I get older, I find that the world repeats itself, and that many of the things that I had feared are still going on and will continue to go on. And I look ahead and I see a very dangerous and dire world as we look further into the future. And I'm wondering whether you have the same feelings and had the same experience, and whether at this point you too are looking optimistically to the future or pessimistically.
Well, I guess we're about the same age. I grew up in the 30s and 40s too, but and those were a very frightening period. I mean, the rise of fascism over Europe was really frightening. Actually, I can remember the first article I wrote, which was I'll tell you exactly when it was. It was February 1939. It was right after the fall of Barcelona. It was a fourth grade newspaper I was the editor and the only reader of, I guess. And it was, I kind of remember it, was about this symbol of Austria falling and Czechoslovakia falling. Now Franco's taking over Spain. What's going to come next? It looked like this monstrous plague was going to spread over the world. Then came the Depression, was bad enough. Much more serious economic crisis than anything that's happened in the years since. Then comes the war. The Holocaust wasn't really known then. It was known, bits and pieces were known, but it was really only known about later. And then at the end of the war, after all, I mean, you can probably remember August 8th, 1945, right, when the atom bomb was used. I mean, that struck me as being as terrifying as the rise of fascism over Europe. I mean, that could be the end of the world. It may turn out to be the end of the world, but it was already pretty clear on August 6th, 1945. Even worse, a couple days later when Nagasaki was bombed. Then came many real horrors. I mean, the threats of the Cold War were in fact exaggerated, but they weren't. Something real was exaggerated. And so it goes on. Is it worse now? In some ways, yes. I mean, there are two, maybe three contingencies that might really deal a lethal blow to the survival of the species. One remains nuclear weapons, and that threat is getting worse, unfortunately. Another is environmental catastrophe, and we may be near some kind of tipping point on that. It's not a joke. Another is pandemics. I mean, if there's a bird flu mutation of a kind that could happen, it could lead to a pandemic in which huge numbers of people would die. And very little is being done about any of these things. In fact, in many ways, they're getting worse. So there's reasons for pessimism. On the other hand, there are reasons for optimism, including those we just were talking about. It's a much more civilized society than it was 30 or 40 years ago, in many respects, including those we mentioned. And you can see it in policy as well. I mean, back in the 50s and the 60s, the United States was overthrowing governments at will, imposing brutal, violent, murderous tyrannies. You know, every year there'd be a couple of them. We can't do that anymore. The last time the United States tried to support a military coup to overthrow a democratic government was in 2002 in Venezuela. And it was overturned within a couple of days. For one thing, because there was a huge uproar in Latin America about it, most of Latin America, and also because there was a popular uprising, and also because the U.S. couldn't do it openly, you know, the way it was done in the past, because there's too much opposition here. Well, those are reasons. Things like that are reasons for optimism. So you take a choice. I mean, you can be pessimistic if you like, bewail the imagined golden days of the past, or look at the things that are positive and try to amplify them.
Does anyone else have a question? Yes, you.
I often wonder if it's a bit tricky to detangle what's going on a social, the social from the biological, and I tag that question onto the gentleman's last question. So when I talk about the social, I just think everything about human activities. That's how I think about it from the social. So biologically, is there something underlying what we see going on a social level? And in that way, is that a commentary about human beings, where this circular, cyclic thing about what we do keeps repeating itself? Is that about human nature?
Of having grown up in the 1930s is I can't hear what you're saying.
So I think that the nature of her question was that to her, it seems that there is some connectivity between the social and the biological aspects of humanity and just sort of humanity in general. Correct? Yes.
What kind of creature are we?
Exactly. So do you see any sort of relationship in the biological end of things that sort of explains the more social aspects, I guess, of the way we act and why we do what we do? Is that correct? Yes.
Tangle the two.
One of the many areas where I think people should be pretty skeptical is in what you read about this. I mean, it's a very popular topic these days to discuss what evolutionary psychology, as it's now called, sociobiology, used to be, teaches us about the nature of humans. But the problem is it doesn't teach us anything much at all. It's an extremely hard scientific problem to understand the nature of any organism, say insects. Where you can do any experiment you like. When you get to something as complex as human beings, what you just find is almost anything you look for. You want to find aggressiveness and violence and sadism. Yeah, we can find that. We don't need evolutionary psychology to tell us about it. We see it in the world. You want to find self-sacrifice, courage, integrity, a willingness to sacrifice yourself for some totally remote species, like to wade out into the wintry waters of Cape Cod and save dolphins. You can find that. You can find what you look for. Humans have all of these capacities. Different ones manifest themselves in different circumstances and with different backgrounds and so on. But the sciences just don't reach far enough to answer questions like this. A little, it's worth looking at. There's interesting work, say Robert Trivers' work on reciprocal altruism, which is very interesting, how a willingness to have an altruistic relation to someone else could pay off in terms of selection survival. Yeah, it could, and that tells you maybe something interesting about the roots of this concept. It's not a new idea, incidentally. The first book on this topic, called Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution, was written over a century ago by Kropotkin, leading anarchist thinker, who was also a natural historian. And he tried to show, this is, I think, maybe 1902 or something like that, that he didn't have a lot of evidence, but he tried to argue that in the natural world and up to humans, mutual aid, a commitment to help others and help the community, would be, could have survival value and could have been selected for. So maybe that's the kind of creature we are. And in some sense, yes, that's the kind of creature we are. We're also, unfortunately, any other kind of creature you like. So yes, there's certainly a connection, and someday maybe it'll be understood. But, and there's something known about it. It's not that knowledge is zero. But a big grain of salt is necessary whenever you read articles in the New York Times Magazine about it.
Other questions? Yes.
I wonder, how much thought do you put into, when you write, into doing something that's effective? And it must have been frustrating, and I don't know when you probably were most frustrated, realizing that facts and reality didn't really change things much. You know, that you could explain something to Congress people or whatever, and they'd still vote for $1 million a day to El Salvador. It must be maddening. But as speaking of diving deeper, I mean, what do you think we can do to, apart from using facts, which don't seem to work, to increase the sense of empathy that we seem to lack when we, bomb other countries indiscriminately or destroy them economically? Do you put much thought to, how we can actually make something happen from what, you explained to us so beautifully?
Well, yeah, but I don't think there's any.
May I just rephrase that on the mic so that people can hear it, just in terms of, I think he's asking what sort of thought goes into what Professor Chomsky is writing as he goes, understanding that perhaps words and ideas do not have the same efficacy now, at least, that they may used to have had. So that going forward, is there a way to sort of plan what you're going to write that sort of affects people in a way where they have, I think, a greater sensibility then of what we're doing abroad and what the political sense of is that?
Well, or even, the fact that there's a couple hundred people here with a better raised consciousness, it doesn't change the fact that we're bombing other countries and doing things, and there's no repercussions for the leaders or our representatives.
But why do you think it doesn't change things? There are things that the United States did, that leaders did quite freely years ago and can't do now. So take the most liberal administrations, like, say, Kennedy. Kennedy was carrying out a major terrorist war against Cuba. It wasn't particularly secret, not all the details were known then that are known now. But when Arthur Schlesinger, in his biography of Robert Kennedy, wrote that John F. Kennedy, he was there, of course, that John F. Kennedy gave Robert Kennedy the task of bringing the terrors of the earth to Cuba, and that Robert Kennedy picked that as his highest priority and went ahead and did it. American presidents can't do that now because of the change of consciousness, just as they can't overthrow governments or take bombings. Look, the Iraq War is bad enough, and if they go after Iran, it will be much worse. But it doesn't remotely compare with the Indochina wars. What we knew at the time was horrifying enough, but what has come out recently and is not being reported, though you can find it, is much worse. So take, say, Cambodia. We now know, we didn't know in 1972, but we now know that in 1973, Nixon gave Kissinger the orders to carry out massive bombing of Cambodia, and Kissinger transmitted those orders to Al Haig with the words which were something like this: massive bombing against against Cambodia, anything that flies against anything that moves. Now, you're going to have to work pretty hard to find a call for genocide at that level in the archives of any state. Well, we now know it. We didn't know it then. And something happened after that. Lost my mic. Mic gone. Can you hear me if I...
So you're not believe that we're on a really good path?
Well, a good path, you know, a better path. I mean, there's two trajectories going on. One is the dangers and the threats are getting much worse. In fact, they may be threats to survival. On the other hand, there's an improvement in consciousness and understanding and commitment and solidarity. Which one is going faster?
We've lost the mic. We can't hear it all.
Sorry.
Just give us one moment. Yeah. Is mine on? Is that working, guys? Okay. Then it's over to you.
Did I do something? How about this? Is it working? Oh, okay. Well, I'll hold it then.
Yeah, I guess this will be the...
Well, at what point did I lose it? Let me go back a little. Cambodia. Okay. In 1973, Henry Kissinger transmitted to the Air Force, Al Haig, the Nixon's orders to bomb Cambodia. The words were something like this: massive bombing campaign against Cambodia, anything that flies against anything that moves. Okay? Suppose that at the trial of Milosevic, the international trial, somebody had found somewhere a statement of Milosevic's saying against Bosnia, anything that flies against anything that moves. Okay? Trial would be over, you get 25 death sentences, finished. You know? This is us. It was reported, barely. You can find it.
But Kissinger's not on trial.
He's not on trial, and very few people know about it, nor do they know about the consequences. There was a study by two leading Cambodian scholars, Ben Kiernan and Owen Taylor. Ben Kiernan is the head of the Genocide Project at Yale, well-known Cambodia scholar, Taylor too. They published an article in which they went through documents that had been declassified during the Clinton years on the actual bombing of Cambodia. It turns out it was 5 times as high as the horrifying level that was already known. The bombing of rural Cambodia was greater than the total Allied bombing in all theaters throughout World War II directed against rural Cambodia. And as they point out, one of the effects was that the Khmer Rouge, who'd been a marginal group in Cambodia, became a huge army of enraged peasants. And we know what they did next. Okay? Well, that information is now there. You can find it. It wasn't their article appeared in a Canadian journal. As far as I know, the only publication of it in the United States is an article on ZNet that I posted there. And now it's appearing in some other places and so on. But, you know, these are things that happened freely. We can at least now know about them. And no American government is doing anything like that now, nor could they. As for the effect of the public, it's significant. I don't know if you've ever looked at the Pentagon Papers, the full Pentagon Papers, not the excerpts that appeared in the New York Times. But take a look sometime at the ending. It ends in early 1968, right after the Tet Offensive. After the Tet Offensive, Johnson wanted to send another couple 100,000 troops to South Vietnam. The Joint Chiefs opposed it. And the reason that they opposed it is they thought they would need these troops here for civil disorder control because of the popular reaction that would take place if they did it. You may not convince many congressmen to vote differently, but you can get people to understand that they'll look at these things differently. And when they do, that creates a kind of a background in which any leader is going to have to react. I mean, even a dictatorship, you can't ignore the population. And in a relatively free society, you certainly can't. So therefore, decisions are made differently. The leaders become followers much more than they'd want to, and as we would want them to be, because there are things they just can't do. So I'm not as convinced as you seem to be about the inefficacy of trying to reach people to encourage them to think about things. I think it works. May not work as fast as we'd like, but it has an effect. And beyond that, there's nothing else to do. You know, there's not any magic trick around that's going to achieve anything. If there's another way to bring about meaningful social change or cultural change, I've never heard of it. So that's what we're stuck with, and it does work.
It's sort of, I don't know, is this working? Anybody? Okay. It sort of begs a question that a student who was a senior at Brandeis last year asked when we hosted Howard Zinn there. He got up and I think very, very genuinely said, I'm about to graduate. I'm about to go out into the world. And he said, I think I do have a real social conscience. I really do want to change things. I really don't like a lot of what I see, and I think I could have an impact. He said at the same time, I want a family. I want a wife. I want kids. I want a steady job. I want to be able to support myself. And he said, so then what is left to me to do? What is in my control? What are the things that I can hold on to? And I think as a parent, as that may seem to some of us, I think to a lot of us that's not quite apparent as to how do you balance, I think, a lifestyle that America has given us that is better than you'll find in many places in the world, and yet, how do you keep that while trying to alter, the things you don't like about the social landscape? Oops. You're not. Sorry, tilted.
Not working.
I don't know yet.
Well, it's
cups and
it's
strings.
It's a kind of poignant picture that you're describing, because one answer to that question is look at the person you're asking the question to. I mean, that's one way you could do it. So Howard Zinn had a family, supports the family. He's changed. He's probably had more effect on the current generation's understanding of the world than anybody I can think of, just from people's history alone, let alone from actions he's been carrying out since his early support for the activists in the civil rights movement back in the 1960s when he was thrown out of Spelman College for supporting black students. These are the kinds of things you can do. And we happen to be, people like us, or like most of us, I guess, uniquely privileged. I mean, we have a tremendous amount of freedom, thanks to the struggles of people in the past. We have by comparative standards, historical standards, an enormous amount of privilege. That confers opportunities. And I think I get questions like that every day. Tonight when I go home and look at my email, there's going to be 20 letters like that. But I think that the problem that young people face is there's just too many choices. I mean, it's not that you can't think of anything that you can do. You can think of so many things you can do. You can't choose. Should I become involved in political activism? Should I join a solidarity group? Should I try to organize anti-sweatshop movement? I mean, I can think of thousands of things that you can do. And my own children have picked some of them and done them. Other people I know have done a lot of them. They're there. The opportunities are there for older people too. Do we want to make use of them? That's the question.
I think the options part is definitely true, but I think maybe less spoken about openly and dealt with in the public. I think is a large component of fear, and I think that when you speak about the '60s and the movements that followed, to us, our age, we see the sacrifices made and that were required of the people who put themselves forward the most during that period to lay that sort of foundation. And so I think it is counterbalanced by the sense of what can be lost in this. And the question is, you're reframing this, I think, in a way that is very helpful in this idea that there's enough to hope for where perhaps the loss needs to be, the sense of the fear of loss needs to be tempered. But I think both seem to play an equal part to a lot of people. As much as...
Suppose, there's another way of looking at that. Suppose you decide, okay, I don't want to take the chance. I don't want to become involved in any of these things. I'm going to invest in the stock market, have a nice home somewhere, or go to the movies and so on. There's a big loss involved in that, too. You look back on your life and you think, what a waste it was. Somebody like, say, Howard Zinn doesn't look back on his life that way. So there's all kinds of losses to calculate.
I think what he was asking for, though, may have been a balance between the two, and that's something that's we rarely speak in shades of gray. We speak in terms of the sense of, we would all like to be Howard Zinn, I think. I think we would all like to sort of take something like that on and have that sense of self-courage that seems almost indefatigable, that you just don't wear down. You consistently go and manage to make something great for your life out of it. But I think...
And have a huge effect.
Absolutely. And I think, and yet there's a sense of your odds on that. And people don't like gambling in that way, I guess.
But let me say again, you're gambling either way.
Certainly.
If you decide not to make use of the opportunities that you have, not to try to live your life in a way which is constructive and helpful, you end up looking back and say, why did I bother living? Mm-hmm. That's a loss too.
Yes.
You pointed to how privileged we are in this country, but within the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the life expectancy of black males is worse than in some third world countries. The life expectancy of Americans in general is worse than some European countries.
Yeah, in fact, life expectancy in the United States is approximately like Cuba, I think. Infant mortality in the United States is like Malaysia. That's why, if I remember to, I qualified and I said most of us have a unique, historically, comparatively unique level of privilege. Not all of us. Certainly not many miles from where we're talking. Maybe right next door, I don't know the town. So yeah, you're right. I mean, there's the fact that the United States ranks at about the lowest level of the industrial countries in things like quality of social indicators, things like infant mortality, abuse, things like that. That's a scandal. I mean, this is the richest, most privileged country in history. It's scandalous that there should be something like an infant mortality level compares to Malaysia, or that black males should have a lower life expectancy than many third world countries. It's a real scandal, and it's a scandal that goes deep into our history. In the case of black males, it goes right back to slavery. There's a claim that, the 14th Amendment is supposed to have given equal rights to everyone. It's a century of, it was a century before it was even formally implemented. And it's still very far from actually implemented, as the statistics you mentioned indicate, or the incarceration rate indicates. Yeah, these are these scandals, and the scandals we can do something about. I mean, very concretely, people want to know what to do. Okay, take the problem that in the United States has been ranking right at the top in polls as the most serious problem that people face for years, namely the disastrous healthcare system. It is a catastrophe, considering the options that are available. We have, I'm sure most of you know, we have about twice the per capita costs of comparable industrial societies, and about the worst outcomes among industrial societies. Literally at about the level of Cuba, a poor third world society that's under constant attack by us. Is there anything to be done about it? Yeah, of course. And in fact, most people know perfectly well what can be done about it. I mean, for decades, a large majority of the population has been in favor of a national health care system, which would have a fraction of the costs and much better outcomes. It has been, up until recently, this election is interesting in this respect. This is the first election, really, in which there is some attempt on the part of a number of candidates to respond to the long-standing public will on this. Not completely, but at least partially. You go back one election, 2004, and it was just off the agenda. In fact, you may recall the last presidential debate in the 2004 election was on domestic issues. And the New York Times had a report on it the next day, an accurate report, in which it pointed out that Kerry had not brought up the issue of any government role in health care. And the reason was that it has so little political support. It's just supported by a large majority of the population, as it had been for decades. But that's not political support. What the reporter meant is it was opposed by the financial institutions and the pharmaceutical corporations, so it didn't have any political support. Well, this election, things have changed enough so that the Democratic candidates are talking about it. Some of them have proposals that are not too far from what the public has wanted for years. What changed? Well, I think two things changed. One, better understanding and more commitment. Something else changed, which does not reflect well on the nature of our society. There is now a component of concentrated capital that is in favor of it, namely manufacturing industry. Manufacturing industry is getting slaughtered by the inefficient health system. So General Motors says that it costs them over $1,000 more to produce a car in Detroit than in, say, Windsor, Canada, across the border. So they want to have a rational health care system. All right, at that point you start getting something that's called political support. You know, a major sector of concentrated economic power is interested in it. Not very nice, but it's a step forward, and it means that the population can be organized to press for it. So you won't have statistics of the kind that you're talking about. That's not utopian. You know, these are pretty simple proposals. Actually, in a recent book of mine, I went through polls of people's attitudes. It turns out that the public opinion and public policy are miles apart on many crucial issues. And in fact, when you run through a list, when I run through a list of things that people favor, I find myself pretty much in the center of public opinion on many things. Well, can you do something about it? Can you make these things politically possible, even if no sector of the corporate elite happens to be for them? Sure you can. It's been done in the past, can be done again. So we're back to optimism. Yeah, it can be, and opportunities. You can do it if you try. If you don't try, it won't happen.
Well, in my general sense of discombobulation and loss of time, I've run very short. But we are a bookstore, and I will run over for the one question that I think I at least desperately would like to know, which is what in the last year of reading, what was the most important or entertaining or just valuable, you know, whether it's Dr. Seuss by the nightstand or whatever else sort of book. What was your favorite book of last year?
Well, there are a lot of books. I'm not sure which was the favorite. I'd have to think and look at my bookshelf, but there are well, there's a couple of very good books that came out that on topics I happen to be interested in. One of them is a book on the international economic system by Noam Chomsky. It's called Bad Samaritans. He's a very good economist and economic historian who goes through in a lucid, even entertaining way, things that are kind of known. He adds a lot of new material about how economic development has really taken place. And it turns out, as any economic historian ought to know, that it's exactly the opposite of the prescriptions that are that the economic elite and the institutions try to impose on the rest of the world. Exactly the opposite. Goes through it case by case, very convincingly. All the rich countries developed by violating the rules we're trying to impose on others, and so on. And that's worth knowing. It's readable, available to the public, and so on. Another one that I read about the same time was Peter Howard's book, which just came out recently, on the overthrow of the Aristide government in Haiti in 2004, in which the U.S. and France, who have been the two major torturers of Haiti for 200 years, played an essential role in overthrowing the democratic government, bringing about a reign of terror, and so on. That's worth knowing. Another book was a really magisterial study by, if anybody's interested in Israel, it's by Zev Maoz, Israeli strategic analyst, political scientist, I don't know, 800 pages or so, on, it's called Defending the Holy Land or some name like that, in which he runs through the actual policies from the inside that Israel has undertaken and discusses how self-destructive they've been, case by case, let alone what they've done to other people. And we've supported them all the way through. Just finished a really very good book by Mike Davis, who's a great writer, called In Praise of Barbarians, or some name like that, in which he's, the theme is the barbarians overthrew the Roman Empire. We've got to praise the people who are trying to overthrow this empire. And it's a very insightful and decisive study of many different aspects of American society. And, you know, it could easily go on. Lots of them.
I said Harry Potter, too.
Harry Potter, can't forget that. Except that I can't read it anymore. When my grandchildren were little enough, they wanted it to be read to them. But now that they're 9, 10 years old, that's over. They want to read it themselves the first night it comes out. I gotta go, I'm afraid.
Professor Noam Chomsky, thank you very, very much.
Noam Chomsky, Institute Professor Emeritus at MIT, is the author of many books on American foreign policy, including Failed States, The Abuse of Power and the Assault on Democracy, and What We Say Goes, Conversations on U.S. Power in a Changing World. For more on Professor Chomsky's work, visit chomsky.info.